Rachel Martinez thought she had uncovered her husband's worst secret when she found the fake social media profiles. What she discovered next would expose a web of lies so elaborate that it would destroy their 20-year marriage, ruin his career, and send shockwaves through their entire suburban community. But the twisted catfishing scheme was just the beginning of a deception that went deeper than she ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rachel Martinez had always prided herself on being married to the most reliable man in Cedar Hills. At 41, she was a successful real estate agent who had built her reputation on reading people, understanding their motivations, and spotting deception from a mile away, which made it even more devastating when she realized that for months, possibly years, she had been completely blind to the elaborate fantasy world her husband had constructed right under her nose. The discovery came on a humid Tuesday morning in July, the kind of sweltering Denver day that made everyone irritable and careless. David had rushed out to his job at Morrison Tech Solutions, leaving his laptop open on their kitchen counter while he grabbed coffee and kissed her goodbye. Nothing unusual there. David Chen had been her devoted husband for 20 years, a mild-mannered IT consultant who preferred staying home with a good book to going out with friends. Rachel was running late for a client meeting and needed to print some contracts. Her own laptop was upstairs charging, and David's MacBook sat conveniently open, logged into his accounts. She clicked on the browser to access her email, but instead of her usual homepage, she was confronted with something that made her blood freeze. Facebook was open to a profile she had never seen before. The name read Michael Rivers, and the profile picture showed a handsome man with salt and pepper hair and striking blue eyes. Someone who looked nothing like her husband, but somehow familiar in a way that made her stomach lurch. The timeline was filled with romantic messages, flirtatious comments, and intimate conversations with someone named Stephanie Walsh. Rachel's hands trembled as she scrolled through the messages. Michael Rivers was in an intense online relationship with this woman, sharing detailed stories about his life as a successful architect in Portland, his recent divorce, and his dreams of starting over with someone special. The messages went back months, growing progressively more intimate and emotionally connected. But what made Rachel's world tilt off its axis was the realization that Michael Rivers was using photos of her brother-in-law, Tony Martinez, who lived in Phoenix. David had somehow stolen Tony's pictures from social media and created an entirely fictional identity to seduce a woman online. She screenshotted everything with shaking fingers, her mind racing to process what she was seeing. The messages were detailed and consistent, painting a picture of a man who was charming, successful, and emotionally available. Everything David pretended to be in their marriage, but amplified and perfected for digital consumption. The worst part was reading the romantic promises. Michael Rivers talked about meeting Stephanie in person, about building a life together, about how she was the woman he had been searching for his entire life. The same words David had spoken to Rachel during their courtship, now recycled for a stranger who had no idea she was falling in love with a complete fabrication. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text from her client reminding her about their appointment. She quickly forwarded the screenshots to her personal email, closed the browser, and grabbed her purse. But as she drove to the showing, her mind was reeling with questions that had no good answers. How long had this been going on? Was Stephanie the only one? What did David want from these women? The luxury condominium she was showing blurred past her vision as she mechanically walked her clients through the space. She heard herself reciting square footage and amenity details, but her mind was replaying every suspicious moment from the past year. David's increased phone usage, his new interest in fitness and grooming, his claims about working late on projects that seemed to have no end date. When her clients left to discuss their decision, Rachel sat in her car in the parking garage and called her sister, Elena, the only person she trusted completely. Elena, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask questions until I can explain everything. Rachel, you're scaring me. What's wrong? I need you to call Tony and ask if anyone has been using his photos online without permission. Tell him you saw someone who lived exactly like him on a dating site or something casual like that. Elena was quiet for a moment. This is about David, isn't it? Please just call Tony. I'll explain everything tonight, but I need to know if my suspicions are right before I do something stupid. An hour later, Elena called back with confirmation that made Rachel feel sick. Tony had recently noticed some suspicious friend requests from women he didn't know, and when he looked into it, he found several fake profiles using his pictures. He had reported them to Facebook, but new ones kept appearing. Rachel, Elena said carefully, Tony asked if this had anything to do with David. He said David had been asking a lot of questions about his job, his hobbies, even his workout routine when they talked at Christmas. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. David hadn't just stolen Tony's photos randomly. He had been gathering information about Tony's life to make his fictional identity more believable. Every family gathering, every casual conversation, every innocent detail about Tony's life in Phoenix was intelligence gathering for David's elaborate deception. That evening, Rachel sat in her car outside their house in the quiet suburb of Lakewood, trying to decide how to confront the man she thought she knew. Their colonial-style home looked peaceful and normal, with David's Honda Accord parked in the driveway and the porch light glowing warmly. From the outside, they looked like the successful, stable couple their neighbors envied. Inside, David was cooking dinner, humming softly to himself as he moved around their granite-countered kitchen. He looked up with a genuine smile when she walked in, the same warm expression that had made her fall in love with him 23 years ago when they met in college. "How was your day, beautiful?" he asked, wiping his hands on a dish towel before coming over to kiss her cheek. "I made that pasta you like with the roasted vegetables." Rachel studied his face, searching for any sign of guilt or deception, but David looked exactly like always, slightly rumpled from his day at the office, his black hair showing more gray than it had 5 years ago, and his kind brown eyes crinkling with affection as he looked at her. "David, you need to talk about something." "Of course, let me just turn down the heat on this sauce and then you have my full attention." He moved around the kitchen with the familiarity of someone who had shared the space for 20 years. David had always been the more domestic one in the relationship, enjoying cooking and home improvement projects while Rachel focused on building her real estate career. Their division of labor had worked perfectly for years, creating a harmony that their friends often commented on admiringly. "I found something on your laptop today," Rachel said, watching his face carefully. "Something that I need you to explain." David's expression didn't change immediately, but she caught the slight pause in his movements, the way his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the wooden spoon he was holding. "What kind of something?" he asked, his tone still casual, but with an undercurrent of wariness. "A Facebook profile for someone named Michael Rivers, using Tony's pictures, having very intimate conversations with a woman named Stephanie." The wooden spoon clattered to the floor as David's face went completely white. For a moment, he looked like he might faint, his normally steady composure cracking like glass. "Rachel, I can explain," he said quickly, but his voice came out strangled and desperate. "Please do," she replied, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my husband has been conducting an elaborate online affair using stolen photos and a completely fictional identity." David sank onto one of their kitchen bar stools, his head falling into his hands. The silence stretched between them while the pasta sauce simmered forgotten on the stove, filling the air with the smell of garlic and herbs that would forever remind Rachel of this moment. "It's not what you think," he said finally, his voice muffled by his hands. "Then tell me what it is." David looked up at her with eyes that were red-rimmed and desperate. It started as a stupid game, just curiosity about what it would be like to be someone else online, someone more interesting, more successful. "Using my brother-in-law's photos? I know how that sounds, but I never meant for it to go this far. I was just lonely, Rachel. We've been so busy with work, so focused on our careers, and I felt invisible. Michael Rivers was supposed to be a fantasy, a way to feel interesting again. Rachel pulled out her phone and scrolled through the screenshots she had taken. This conversation is from 3 days ago. Michael Rivers is talking about flying to Minneapolis to meet Stephanie in person. He's making specific plans, David. Hotel reservations, restaurant recommendations, romantic weekend getaways. How is that a harmless fantasy? David's face crumpled as he realized she had seen more than just casual flirting. I never intended to actually meet her. It felt good to have someone be excited about me, to think I was fascinating and romantic. So you decided to catfish a stranger using stolen photos and lies? Don't call it catfishing, David snapped, then immediately looked ashamed of his tone. I'm sorry. That word makes it sound predatory, and I'm not trying to hurt anyone. Aren't you? Rachel asked, her anger finally breaking through her shock. What do you think is going to happen when Stephanie realizes that the man she's falling in love with doesn't exist? What happens when she shows up at that hotel expecting to meet Michael Rivers and finds nobody there? David hadn't considered the impact on his victim, which became obvious from his stunned expression. In his mind, the online relationship had been about his own emotional needs, not about the real woman on the other end who was investing her heart in a complete fiction. We need to look at this together, Rachel said, gesturing toward his laptop. All of it. Every profile, every conversation, every lie you've told. Because I have a feeling Stephanie isn't the only one. David's face went even paler, which Rachel hadn't thought was possible. Rachel, please, can't we just delete everything and move on? I'll stop, I promise. It was stupid, and I'm sorry, and it will never happen again. Show me the laptop, David. I can't. Why not? Because, he whispered, there are other profiles, and if you see all of it, you will leave me. The admission hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Rachel felt something inside her chest break open, not her heart exactly, but her fundamental understanding of who she had married and what their life together actually meant. How many others? She asked. David was crying now, silent tears rolling down his cheeks as he stared at his hands. I don't know. Maybe a dozen different profiles over the past 2 years? A dozen?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rachel repeated the number, trying to process it. You've been conducting emotional affairs with a dozen different women using fake identities? They're not affairs, David protested weakly. I never met any of them in person. I never even intended to meet them. What did you intend, David? What was the point of building these elaborate relationships with women who think they're talking to someone who doesn't exist? He looked up at her with an expression so lost and pathetic that for a moment, Rachel almost felt sorry for him. I wanted to feel special again. I wanted someone to think I was interesting and exciting instead of just ordinary. So you decided to become someone else entirely? Not someone else, a better version of myself. Michael Rivers has my personality, my sense of humor, my interests. He's just more successful, more confident, more attractive. He's a lie, David. And so is whatever you've been telling these women about your life, your job, your marriage status. David flinched at the word marriage. I told them I was divorced. Of course you did. Rachel walked over to the stove and turned off the burner under the pasta sauce, performing the mundane task of preventing their dinner from burning while her marriage disintegrated around her. The normalcy of the action felt surreal, like she was an actress playing the role of a wife in a kitchen while the real Rachel screamed in horror somewhere deep inside. I want to see everything, she said without turning around. Every profile, every conversation, every photo you've stolen. And then we're going to figure out how to clean up this mess you've created. And then? David asked quietly. Rachel turned to face him,
this man she had loved for 20 years, who had been living a double life that made a mockery of everything she thought they shared. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I need to understand what I'm dealing with before I can decide whether our marriage can survive it." That night, sitting side by side at their kitchen table with David's laptop open between them, Rachel discovered that her husband's deception was far more extensive and sophisticated than she had imagined. The dozen profiles he had mentioned turned out to be closer to 20, each one carefully crafted with stolen photos, fictional backstories, and detailed personality traits. Michael Rivers, the architect, was just one persona among many. There was also James Park, a successful restaurant owner in Seattle, using photos stolen from David's college roommate. Dr. Christopher Valdez, a pediatrician in San Antonio, whose pictures belonged to Rachel's cousin from Texas. Marcus Thompson, a fitness instructor in Miami, who looked suspiciously like their neighbor's son-in-law. Each profile had been meticulously developed with unique email addresses, social media histories, and even fake LinkedIn accounts. David had created entire fictional careers, complete with workplace details he had researched online and personal anecdotes he had crafted to make each character feel authentic. "How long have you been doing this?" Rachel asked as she scrolled through months of conversations between Dr. Christopher Valdez and a nurse named Maria who worked in Houston. "The first profile was maybe 3 years ago," David admitted. "It was during that rough patch when you were working so much on the riverfront development deal. I felt neglected, and I started chatting with random people online just to have someone to talk to." Rachel remembered that period clearly. She had been working 18-hour days trying to close the biggest commercial real estate deal of her career, often coming home after David was already asleep. She had assumed he understood that the sacrifice was temporary, that the commission from that deal would secure our financial future. "So you decided to cope with my work schedule by creating fake identities to seduce strangers?" "It wasn't supposed to be seduction. The first profile was just me, using my real name and photos. But I wasn't getting any responses. Women online want successful, attractive men. They want someone exciting." "So you became someone exciting?" "I became someone exciting," David corrected miserably. "And it worked. Suddenly I had women who were interested in talking to me, who looked forward to my messages, who thought I was funny and charming." Rachel studied the conversations on the screen, noting the careful way David had crafted each personality to appeal to different types of women. James Park was artistic and sensitive for women who valued creativity. Dr. Christopher Valdez was caring and nurturing for women who wanted a family man. Marcus Thompson was adventurous and spontaneous for women seeking excitement. You've been studying these women, learning their preferences, and adapting your fake personalities to give them exactly what they want? David nodded shamefully. "It's not hard to figure out what someone is looking for if you pay attention to how they talk about their past relationships, their career goals, their family dynamics." "That's manipulation, David. You've been psychologically manipulating vulnerable women for your own entertainment." "I never asked them for money. I never tried to get anything from them except conversation." "You got emotional intimacy. You got their trust, their affection, their time and energy. You made them fall in love with people who don't exist." As Rachel continued scrolling through the conversations, a pattern emerged that made her stomach turn. David wasn't just randomly chatting with women. He was specifically targeting women who were recently divorced, recently widowed, or going through difficult transitions in their lives. Women who were emotionally vulnerable and desperate for connection. Maria, the nurse, had just ended a 7-year relationship and was struggling with loneliness in a new city. Jennifer, the teacher, was a widow whose husband had died of cancer 2 years earlier. Stephanie, the woman who thought she was talking to Michael Rivers, was recently divorced and trying to rebuild her life while raising 2 young children as a single mother. "You're preying on women who are hurting," Rachel said, her voice flat with disgust. "I'm providing comfort to women who need someone to talk to," David replied. But his defense sounded weak even to his own ears. "You're providing false comfort based on lies. These women think they're building genuine connections with real people. They're making important life decisions based on relationships that exist only in your imagination." Rachel clicked on a conversation between Marcus Thompson and a woman named Kelly who lived in Denver, uncomfortably close to their own neighborhood. Kelly was planning to move to Miami to be closer to Marcus, whom she believed was a successful fitness instructor who was falling in love with her. "David," Rachel said quietly, "Kelly is talking about quitting her job and moving across the country to be with Marcus Thompson. She's already put a deposit down on an apartment in Miami." David's face went gray as he read the messages. "I didn't tell her to do that. I never said we should meet in person." "You've been talking to her for 8 months. You've told her you love her. You've made plans for a future together. What did you think was going to happen?" The full scope of the damage David had inflicted began to dawn on both of them. These weren't just harmless online flirtations, they were elaborate emotional cons that were affecting real women's lives in real ways. Women were making financial decisions, career changes, and relationship choices based on their connections with men who existed only in David's imagination. "We have to stop this," Rachel said. "All of it. Tonight." "How?" "You're going to tell each of these women the truth. You're going to explain that you're married, that you've been lying about your identity, and that you're sorry for wasting their time." David looked physically sick at the prospect. "I can't do that. It would destroy them." "You've already destroyed them, David. Every day you continue the charade, you're making it worse. Kelly is planning to move to Miami in 3 weeks. What happens when she gets there and discovers that Marcus Thompson doesn't exist?" "Maybe I could just disappear. Stop responding to messages. Let them think I lost interest or found someone else." That's even more cruel. These women would spend months wondering what they did wrong, whether they said something to drive you away. At least if you tell them the truth, they'll understand that the problem was never with them. Rachel spent the next 4 hours watching her husband craft apology messages to the women he had deceived. Each confession was agonizing to witness, revealing the depth of emotional connection these women had developed with David's fictional characters. Maria responded to Dr. Christopher Valdez's confession with heartbreak and fury, writing pages about how his support had helped her through the worst period of her life. Jennifer, the widow, told James Park that their relationship had been the first time she had felt hope since her husband's death. Kelly's response to Marcus Thompson was the most devastating of all, describing how she had believed she was finally ready to start over with someone who truly understood her. By 3 a.m, David had sent confessions to every woman he could remember deceiving. His face was streaked with tears and his hand shook as he typed each apology. The responses ranged from heartbroken to furious, but all of them shared a common theme. These women had invested months or years of their emotional lives in relationships that had never been real. "I'm a monster," David whispered as he closed the laptop. "I never thought about what this was doing to them. I just wanted to feel good about myself." Rachel looked at her husband, this man she had shared 20 years of her life with, and realized she didn't know him at all. The David she had married was quiet and reliable, maybe a little boring, but fundamentally honest and kind. The man sitting next to her was capable of elaborate deception, psychological manipulation, and callous disregard for other people's feelings. "I need you to sleep in the guest room tonight. I need time to think about what this means for us." David nodded without argument, gathering his things and padding quietly down the hallway. Rachel sat alone in their kitchen as the sun began to rise, surrounded by the remnants of the life she thought she knew. The pasta sauce had congealed in the pan, the dinner they'd never eat growing cold on the counter. But even as she tried to process the enormity of David's betrayal, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she had only seen the tip of the iceberg. The man who could construct such elaborate lies for strangers online might be capable of other deceptions closer to home. Her real investigation was just beginning. The next morning brought the first call from one of David's victims, and Rachel realized that his digital crimes were about to become real problems for both of them. Kelly from Denver had found David's real name through reverse image searches and property records, and she was demanding answers that would change everything. "Mrs. Chen," Kelly's voice was shaky but determined when Rachel answered her cell phone. "My name is Kelly Morrison, and I need to speak with your husband's online activities." Rachel's blood ran cold. In all their planning the night before, neither she nor David had considered that the women he had deceived might have the skills and motivation to track down his real identity. I think there's been some misunderstanding, Rachel said carefully. No misunderstanding. I hired a private investigator to find Marcus Thompson after he sent me that confession message last night. It took my PI about 3 hours to trace the photos back to your neighbor's family and cross-reference that with social media connections to identify your husband as the real person behind the fake profile. Rachel sank onto their living room couch, realizing that David's elaborate digital house of cards was collapsing faster than either of them had anticipated. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want my money back. I want compensation for the 8 months of my life I wasted on your husband's sick fantasy. And I want to make sure he never does this to another woman again." "What money?" Kelly's laugh was bitter and hollow. "The $15,000 I spent moving to Miami to be with a man who doesn't exist, the deposit on an apartment, the shipping costs for my furniture, the job I quit because Marcus convinced me we had a future together." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the legal and financial implications of David's deception. "Kelly, I had no idea David was doing any of this. I only found out yesterday." "That may be true, but you're still married to him, which makes you liable for his debts and damages under Colorado law. My attorney says I have grounds for fraud charges against both of you." "Your attorney?" "I contacted a lawyer this morning after I finished crying. Turns out, what your husband did isn't just morally reprehensible, it's also criminal fraud and possibly identity theft. I'm not the only victim he's contacted, Mrs. Chen. 3 other women have already contacted my attorney's office." Rachel hung up the phone with shaking hands and immediately called Elena, the only person she trusted to help her navigate the legal nightmare that was unfolding. "I need the name of the best criminal defense attorney in Denver," she told her sister without preamble. "Rachel, what happened? You said David was catfishing someone, but this sounds like something much bigger." "It is something much bigger. He's been running fake profiles for years, and now his victims are hiring attorneys and threatening criminal charges. One woman moved across the country because she thought she was in love with one of his fake identities." Elena was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "How much money are we talking about?" "I don't know yet, but Kelly mentioned $15,000 just for moving expenses, and she said 3 other women have already contacted her attorney." "Rachel, you need to protect yourself financially. If David has been committing fraud, you could lose everything you've worked for." The advice was sound, but it felt like a betrayal of 20 years of marriage. Rachel had never imagined she would need to protect herself from her own husband, the man she had trusted with every aspect of her life. David returned from his morning run to find Rachel sitting at their kitchen table with a yellow legal pad covered in notes and a laptop open to several attorney websites. "What's all this?" he asked, still breathing hard from his exercise. "Kelly Morrison called me this morning. She hired a private investigator to find your real identity, and now she has an attorney who's threatening criminal fraud charges." David's face went white as he absorbed the information. "She found us?" "She found us, and apparently she's not the only one. 3 other women have already contacted her attorney's office." David sank into the chair across from Rachel, his post-workout glow fading rapidly. "What do they want?" "Money. Compensation for the damages they suffered because of your lies. Kelly alone is asking for $15,000. "We don't have $15,000 to spare." "We might not have a choice. Her attorney says what you did constitutes criminal fraud, David. You could be facing jail time." For the first time since the whole nightmare began, David seemed to truly understand the consequences of his actions. His online fantasies had seemed harmless to him because they existed in a digital realm separate from his real life. But the women he had deceived were real people with real lives, and they were not willing to let his crimes go unpunished. "What do we do?" he asked quietly. Rachel looked at her husband. This man whose selfishness and stupidity had destroyed their marriage and potentially their entire future, and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. "We're going to fight back," she said, "but not in the way you think." Rachel's decision to fight back began with a methodical investigation that would make her husband's elaborate deceptions look like amateur hour. While David sat in his guest room feeling sorry for himself, Rachel transformed their home office into a command center dedicated to uncovering every lie he had told and every woman he had deceived. The first step was understanding the full scope of the damage. Rachel created spreadsheets tracking each fake profile David had admitted to, cross-referencing them with the photos he had stolen and the women he had deceived. But as she dug deeper into his digital footprints, she discovered that David had been far more prolific and systematic than even he had admitted. Using password recovery tools and browser history analysis, Rachel found evidence of at least 30 different fake profiles across multiple platforms. David hadn't just been active on Facebook. He had created elaborate personas on Instagram, dating apps, professional networking sites, and even hobby forums. Each identity was carefully crafted to appeal to specific demographics and interests. The stolen photos came from an extensive network of acquaintances, family members, and even complete strangers whose social media profiles David had harvested. He had been particularly clever about choosing men who lived in different states, reducing the chances that his victims would encounter the real people behind the photos. But what disturbed Rachel most was discovering the detailed files David had kept on each woman he was manipulating. Hidden in encrypted folders on his computer were psychological profiles, personal histories, and emotional vulnerabilities that he had cataloged like a predator studying his prey. Maria Santos, the Houston nurse, had trust issues stemming from childhood abuse. David's Dr. Christopher Valdez persona had positioned himself as a healing figure who understood trauma. Jennifer Walsh, the widowed teacher, was struggling with depression after her husband's death. James Park had carefully crafted messages designed to make her feel worthy of love again. Each profile revealed David's sophisticated understanding of emotional manipulation. He had researched psychology articles about grief, divorce recovery, and attachment disorders to make his fake personalities more effective at exploiting vulnerable women. "You studied them," Rachel said when she confronted David with the evidence that evening. "You didn't just randomly chat with these women. You researched their psychological vulnerabilities and designed your fake personalities to exploit them." David sat across from her in their living room, looking smaller and more pathetic than she had ever seen him. I wanted to help them feel better about themselves. You wanted to control them. Look at this." Rachel pulled up a document titled Maria, Deployment Strategy, that outlined specific topics to avoid, phrases that would trigger her anxiety, and emotional buttons that would make her more dependent on Dr. Valdez's validation. I never thought of it like that. What did you think you were doing when you wrote, "Subject responds positively to medical terminology and detailed health advice, avoid discussing her father, focus on building trust through professional expertise"? David couldn't meet her eyes as she read from his own notes. The clinical language revealed a level of premeditation that transformed his actions from stupid mistakes into calculated psychological abuse. "How many others are there that you haven't told me about?" Rachel asked. I showed you everything last night." "No, you showed me the active profiles. I want to know about every woman you've ever deceived, even the ones where you got bored and disappeared." David's silence was answer enough. Rachel opened her laptop and pulled up a recovery program she had purchased that afternoon, designed to retrieve deleted files and browsing history. "We're going to find them all. Every conversation, every photo, every lie you've told. And then we're going to figure out how to make this right." The recovery process took 3 days and revealed a digital graveyard of abandoned relationships. David had been cycling through women for nearly 4 years, typically maintaining each deception for several months before either losing interest or becoming overwhelmed by the emotional demands of his fictional relationships. Some women had been discarded when they became too clingy or started asking to meet in person. Others had been abandoned when David grew tired of maintaining their particular psychological profile. A few had figured out they were being catfished and confronted him, leading to hasty deletions and panicked cover-ups. But what shocked Rachel most was discovering that David's catfishing activities had escalated over time. His earliest deceptions had been relatively simple, using his own photos with enhanced job descriptions and relationship status. But as he became more sophisticated, his lies had grown more elaborate and his targeting more precise. The most recent profiles showed signs of criminal intent that went beyond emotional manipulation. Marcus Thompson had convinced Kelly Morrison to invest in a fake business opportunity. Dr. Christopher Valdez had offered to help Maria Santos with her student loan debt through a fraudulent refinancing program. James Park had solicited personal financial information from Jennifer Walsh under the guise of helping her plan for retirement. "David," Rachel said, her voice deadly calm as she reviewed bank statements that showed deposits from 3 different women, "you've been stealing money from them." "It's not stealing," David protested weakly. "They wanted to help with business investments. You told Kelly that Marcus Thompson was starting a fitness equipment company and needed capital from trusted friends. You took $8,000 from her for a business that doesn't exist. I was going to pay her back. With what money? Our savings account shows that you've been living off these women's investments for months. The mortgage payments, the car insurance, even the groceries we've been eating were paid for with money you stole from women who thought they were helping their boyfriend succeed." Rachel's investigation revealed that David's deceptions had become a full-time income source. He had convinced multiple women to send him money for various fabricated emergencies and opportunities. Dr. Christopher Valdez needed help with medical conference fees. James Park required assistance with restaurant equipment after a kitchen fire. Marcus Thompson was launching a fitness app and needed development funding. The total amount stolen was approaching $60,000 spread across 14 different victims. David had been methodical about keeping the individual amounts small enough to avoid triggering fraud alerts, but substantial enough to supplement their household income significantly. "You've been supporting our family with stolen money," Rachel said, feeling sick as she calculated their recent expenses against the timeline of David's thefts. "The vacation we took to Vail last winter was paid for with money you stole from grieving widows and struggling single mothers." I never meant for it to go this far," David said, but his excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. "When did you mean for it to stop? When one of these women killed herself because the man she loved disappeared with her life savings? When Kelly's children ended up homeless because their mother spent their security deposit on your fake business?" Rachel's investigation had also revealed the human cost of David's crimes beyond the financial damage. Several of the women he had abandoned had written heartbreaking messages to his fake profiles, describing how his disappearance had destroyed their faith in love and their ability to trust other people. Jennifer Walsh had been hospitalized for a mental health crisis after James Park vanished without explanation.
She had written dozens of messages asking what she had done wrong, whether their entire relationship had been a lie, and why he would abandon her when she needed him most. Maria Santos had quit her nursing job and moved to San Antonio to be closer to Dr. Valdez, only to discover that the medical practice he claimed to work for had never heard of him. She was now unemployed in a strange city, having burned bridges with her previous employer and spent her savings on the relocation. The emotional devastation David had caused was immeasurable, but Rachel was beginning to formulate a plan that would hold him accountable while protecting his victims from further harm. The breakthrough came when Rachel discovered David's master list of target demographics. He had been systematically identifying and cataloging vulnerable women based on their social media activity, relationship status, and emotional state. Newly divorced women, recent widows, single mothers struggling financially, and women recovering from abusive relationships.
David had created algorithms to search for specific keywords and phrases that indicated emotional vulnerability. Terms like starting over, new chapter, healing journey, and ready to trust again would trigger his attention. He would then study their profiles for weeks before creating a fake identity designed to appeal to their specific psychological needs. "You've been hunting them," Rachel said as she reviewed the spreadsheets and search parameters David had developed. "This isn't random loneliness or harmless fantasy. You've been systematically targeting women who are emotionally vulnerable and financially insecure." The evidence painted a picture of predatory behavior that extended far beyond simple adultery or emotional cheating. David had developed a sophisticated system for identifying, grooming, and exploiting women who were least equipped to protect themselves from his manipulations. But Rachel's investigation had also revealed David's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. His elaborate digital persona required constant maintenance and careful coordination. He had made mistakes, left digital trails, and created inconsistencies that a determined investigator could exploit. More importantly, Rachel had discovered that David's victims were beginning to organize themselves. Kelly Morrison's attorney had created a victim advocacy group that was sharing information and coordinating legal action. The women David had hurt were no longer isolated targets. They were becoming a unified force with the resources and motivation to hold him accountable. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon while Rachel was reviewing financial records in her makeshift command center. The caller identified herself as Detective Sarah Kim from the Denver Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit. "Mrs. Chen?" Detective Kim said. "We've received multiple reports about your husband's online activities. I'd like to schedule a time to speak with both of you about some serious allegations." Rachel's blood ran cold as she realized that David's crimes had attracted official attention. What kind of allegations? Wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal impersonation. We have 17 different women who filed complaints, and the FBI is considering federal charges because the scheme crossed state lines. "I had no knowledge of my husband's activities until this week," Rachel said quickly. "That may be, but you're still married to him, which means you could be considered an accessory after the fact if you help him conceal evidence or obstruct our investigation." The detective's words hit Rachel like a physical blow. Not only was David facing serious criminal charges, but her own freedom and reputation were now at risk simply because of their marriage. "Detective Kim," Rachel said carefully, "what if I were willing to cooperate with your investigation?" "What kind of cooperation are you talking about?" "I've been conducting my own investigation into my husband's activities. I've recovered deleted files, documented his methods, and identified victims that haven't come forward yet. I might be able to provide evidence that would be helpful to your case." There was a long pause before Detective Kim responded. "Mrs. Chen, I think we need to have a very detailed conversation about what you've discovered and what you're willing to share." The meeting with Detective Kim took place the following morning at the downtown police station. Rachel arrived with 3 binders of evidence, 2 laptops full of recovered data, and a USB drive containing every conversation, photo, and financial transaction she had been able to document. Detective Kim was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened with growing amazement as Rachel outlined the scope and sophistication of David's operation. "Mrs. Chen," the detective said, after reviewing the evidence, "this is the most comprehensive victim documentation I've ever seen in a catfishing case. You've done better police work than most of my detectives." "I had motivation," Rachel replied, grimly. "I can see that. The question now is whether you're willing to testify against your husband in court." Rachel looked around the sterile interview room, thinking about the 20 years she had spent building a life with a man who had been systematically destroying other women's lives for his own gratification. "Detective Kim," Rachel said, I want to do more than testify. I want to help you catch him in the act. The plan Detective Kim proposed was both elegant and devastating. Rather than arresting David immediately, they would use Rachel as an undercover asset to document his ongoing crimes and gather evidence of his intent to continue defrauding women. Rachel would return home and pretend to forgive David's past behavior while secretly recording their conversations and monitoring his online activities. The goal was to capture him admitting to his crimes, discussing his methods, and potentially attempting to resume his catfishing activities. We need him to demonstrate ongoing criminal intent, Detective Kim explained. A good defense attorney could argue that his past behavior was just emotional infidelity that got out of hand. But if we can show that he's actively planning to continue defrauding women, we can make federal charges stick. Rachel agreed to the plan, but she had her own agenda that went beyond helping the police build their case. She wanted David to understand the full consequences of his actions, to experience the same sense of betrayal and manipulation that he had inflicted on his victims. The next phase of Rachel's plan required acting skills she didn't know she possessed. She returned home that evening and told David that she had decided to forgive his past behavior and work on rebuilding their marriage. "Really?" he asked, his relief palpable. "You're not going to leave me?" "I love you, David. What you did was horrible, but I think we can get through this together if you're completely honest with me and commit to changing." He broke down crying, expressing gratitude for her forgiveness and promising to never lie to him again. The irony wasn't lost on Rachel that her husband was thanking her for a forgiveness that was itself a deception designed to destroy him. Over the next several days, Rachel played the role of the supportive wife while secretly documenting every conversation and monitoring his online activities. She installed keylogger software on his devices, hidden cameras in their home office, and voice-activated recording apps on her phone. The evidence she gathered was damning.
Despite his promises to change, David was already planning his return to catfishing. He spent hours researching new photo sources, brainstorming fresh personas, and studying articles about online manipulation techniques. "I think I could be more successful if I focused on older women," he told Rachel one evening, apparently viewing her as a co-conspirator now that she had forgiven him. "Women in their 50s and 60s are more likely to have money saved up, and they're often more trusting." Rachel smiled and nodded while the recording app captured every word of his plan to target elderly women who would be even more vulnerable to his manipulations. But David's most devastating confession came when Rachel asked him why he had chosen to steal photos from their family members and acquaintances. "It was perfect," he explained enthusiastically. "I knew enough details about their lives to make the personas believable, but they lived far enough away that my victims would never accidentally run into them. Plus, if anyone got suspicious, I could always claim that someone else was using their photos without permission." "What about Tony?" Rachel asked. "Weren't you worried that he might find out you were using his pictures?" "Tony barely uses social media, and even if he found out, what was he going to do? It's not like he could prove I was the one doing it." The casual way David discussed destroying his own family relationships for the sake of his criminal enterprise revealed a level of selfishness that Rachel hadn't fully comprehended before. The recordings also captured David's detailed knowledge of his victims' psychological vulnerabilities and his plans to exploit them more effectively in the future. "Maria was easy because she had daddy issues," he said during one conversation. "Jennifer was harder because she was actually pretty smart, but the grief made her desperate for validation. Kelly was perfect because she had money and low self-esteem." Rachel listened to her husband discuss the women he had emotionally abused with the same clinical detachment that a scientist might use to describe laboratory rats. The man she had loved for 20 years was revealing himself to be a predator who viewed other human beings as resources to be exploited for his own gratification.
But Rachel's most devastating discovery came when she found David's future target list. He had already identified 12 new women to pursue, complete with psychological profiles, financial assessments, and manipulation strategies tailored to each potential victim. The list included women ranging in age from 23 to 67, representing millions of dollars in potential theft and immeasurable emotional damage. David wasn't planning to stop his criminal activities, he was planning to escalate them. Rachel shared all of this evidence with Detective Kim, who was building an airtight case against David with the FBI's Economic Crimes Task Force. But Rachel was also developing her own plan for justice that would go beyond criminal prosecution. The breakthrough came when Rachel discovered that David had been keeping detailed financial records of his thefts, apparently for tax purposes. The spreadsheets showed not only how much money he had stolen from each woman, but also how he had spent their funds and what assets he had purchased with the proceeds. He's been treating fraud like a business, Rachel told Detective Kim during one of their clandestine meetings. He's got profit and loss statements, expense reports, even projected income forecasts based on how many women he planned to target each month. This is unprecedented, Detective Kim replied. Most catfishing cases involve emotional manipulation with minimal financial impact. Your husband has been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. But the evidence also revealed something that would give Rachel significant leverage in both the criminal case and her own plans for justice. David had been underreporting his income to the IRS, failing to pay taxes on money he had stolen from his victims. The tax evasion charges would carry additional penalties and potential prison time, but more importantly, they would trigger asset forfeiture proceedings that could recover money for David's victims. Rachel spent sleepless nights planning her next moves, balancing her personal revenge against her responsibility to help David's victims recover from his crimes. The solution she developed would accomplish both goals while ensuring that David faced consequences that matched the scope of his betrayals. The plan required patience, precision, and a level of deception that would have impressed David himself. But Rachel had learned from the master manipulator, and she was about to demonstrate that she had surpassed her teacher. The first phase involved encouraging David to resume his catfishing activities while secretly documenting everything for law enforcement. Rachel played the supportive wife, even helping David brainstorm new personas and discussing strategies for avoiding detection. Maybe you should use photos from modeling websites instead of people we know, she suggested during one conversation, knowing that the advice would be recorded and used as evidence of her cooperation with the investigation. That's actually brilliant, David replied. Professional photos would be more attractive, and there's no personal connection that could be traced back to us. Rachel smiled and nodded while the recording app captured every word of his plan to target elderly women who would be even more vulnerable to his manipulations. But Rachel's most devastating confession came when Rachel asked him why he had chosen to steal photos from their family members and acquaintances. "It was perfect," he explained enthusiastically. "I knew enough details about their lives to make the personas believable, but they lived far enough away that my victims would never accidentally run into them. Plus, if anyone got suspicious, I could always claim that someone else was using their photos without permission." "What about Tony?" Rachel asked. "Weren't you worried that he might find out you were using his pictures? Tony barely uses social media, and even if he found out, what was he going to do? It's not like he could prove I was the one doing it." The casual way David discussed destroying his own family relationships for the sake of his criminal enterprise revealed a level of selfishness that Rachel hadn't fully comprehended before. The recordings also captured David's detailed knowledge of his victims' psychological vulnerabilities and his plans to exploit them more effectively in the future. "Maria was easy because she had daddy issues," he said during one conversation. "Jennifer was harder because she was actually pretty smart, but the grief made her desperate for validation. Kelly was perfect because she had money and low self-esteem." Rachel listened to her husband discuss the women he had emotionally abused with the same clinical detachment that a scientist might use to describe laboratory rats. The man she had loved for 20 years was revealing himself to be a predator who viewed other human beings as resources to be exploited for his own gratification. But Rachel's most important discovery came when she found David's future target list. He had already identified 12 new women to pursue, complete with psychological profiles, financial assessments, and manipulation strategies tailored to each potential victim. The list included women ranging in age from 23 to 67, representing millions of dollars in potential theft and immeasurable emotional damage. David wasn't planning to stop his criminal activities, he was planning to escalate them. Rachel shared all of this evidence with Detective Kim, who was building an airtight case against David with the FBI's Economic Crimes Task Force. But Rachel was also developing her own plan for justice that would go beyond criminal prosecution. The breakthrough came when Rachel discovered that David had been keeping detailed financial records of his thefts, apparently for tax purposes. The spreadsheets showed not only how much money he had stolen from each woman, but also how he had spent their funds and what assets he had purchased with the proceeds. He's been treating fraud like a business, Rachel told Detective Kim during one of their clandestine meetings. He's got profit and loss statements, expense reports, even projected income forecasts based on how many women he planned to target each month. This is unprecedented, Detective Kim replied. Most catfishing cases involve emotional manipulation with minimal financial impact. Your husband has been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. But the evidence also revealed something that would give Rachel significant leverage in both the criminal case and her own plans for justice. David had been underreporting his income to the IRS, failing to pay taxes on money he had stolen from his victims. The tax evasion charges would carry additional penalties and potential prison time, but more importantly, they would trigger asset forfeiture proceedings that could recover money for David's victims. Rachel spent sleepless nights planning her next moves, balancing her desire for personal revenge against her responsibility to help David's victims recover from his crimes. The solution she developed would accomplish both goals while ensuring that David faced consequences that matched the scope of his betrayals. The plan required patience, precision, and a level of deception that would have impressed David himself. But Rachel had learned from the master manipulator, and she was about to demonstrate that she had surpassed her teacher. The first phase involved encouraging David to resume his catfishing activities while secretly documenting everything for law enforcement. Rachel played the supportive wife, even helping David brainstorm new personas and discussing strategies for avoiding detection. Maybe you should use photos from modeling websites instead of people we know, she suggested during one conversation, knowing that the advice would be recorded and used as evidence of her cooperation with the investigation. That's actually brilliant, David replied. Professional photos would be more attractive, and there's no personal connection that could be traced back to us. Rachel smiled and made notes while the hidden cameras captured David's enthusiasm for her suggestions. Every conversation was building the case that would eventually destroy him. But Rachel's secret plan went far beyond helping law enforcement build their case. She was also preparing a public exposure campaign that would ensure David's crimes became widely known in their community and professional circles. The evidence she had gathered painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior that extended over years and affected dozens of women across multiple states. David's crimes weren't just personal betrayals or even simple fraud. They represented a pattern of psychological abuse that had destroyed lives and shattered families. Rachel began reaching out to David's victims, not as his wife seeking.
David's cooperation with her fake forgiveness had provided law enforcement with enough evidence to arrest him. But Rachel wanted to ensure that the charges would stick and that his victims would receive maximum restitution. The final piece of evidence came when David attempted to resume his criminal activities, despite his promises to change. Rachel watched through hidden cameras as he created new fake profiles using photos downloaded from modeling websites, just as she had suggested. Within hours of launching his new Marcus Thompson persona, David was already engaging with potential victims, using the same psychological manipulation techniques that had worked so effectively in the past. But this time, every message was being recorded and monitored by law enforcement. Rachel felt a mixture of satisfaction and disgust as she watched her husband demonstrate that his remorse had been as fake as everything else about him. David was incapable of change because he fundamentally didn't understand that his victims were real people deserving of respect and honesty. The arrest would come soon.
But Rachel's plan for justice was just beginning. David's criminal prosecution would hold him accountable under the law, but Rachel's public exposure campaign would ensure that his crimes served as a warning that might protect other women from similar predators. As she reviewed the evidence files one final time, Rachel felt a sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. David's victims would receive the support and restitution they deserved. His crimes would be exposed to prevent future harm. And Rachel herself would finally be free from the lies that had defined her marriage. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal through an accidentally opened laptop had become a digital detective whose investigation would ultimately save dozens of other women from similar devastation. Justice was about to be served, and it would be far more comprehensive than David could have ever imagined. The arrest came on a cold Monday morning in November, exactly 3 months after Rachel first discovered David's laptop open to his fake Facebook profile. She watched from their bedroom window as Detective Kim and 2 FBI agents knocked on their front door, knowing that David was downstairs in his office, completely unaware that his digital crimes were about to collide with real-world consequences. Rachel had been awake since 4 in the morning, preparing for this moment with the same methodical precision she had applied to her investigation. She dressed in a navy blue business suit, applied minimal makeup, and arranged the final pieces of evidence that would ensure David's conviction and her own vindication. The sound of David's panicked voice calling her name echoed through the house as federal agents executed their search warrant. Rachel descended the stairs slowly, taking in the scene she had orchestrated with such careful planning. David stood in their living room in his pajamas, surrounded by law enforcement officers who were treating him like the criminal he had become. "Rachel," he said desperately when he saw her, "tell them this is all a misunderstanding. Tell them I stopped everything, that I was just confused, but I'm better now." "I can't tell them that, David," she replied calmly, "because it would be a lie." Detective Kim stepped forward with handcuffs, reading David his rights while he stared at Rachel with growing comprehension. The betrayal in his eyes was almost comical, given the circumstances. "You set me up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I documented your crimes," Rachel corrected. "There's a difference." As the agents led David away, he turned back one final time. "Rachel, please, I love you. Don't let them destroy our life together." "You destroyed our life together 3 years ago, when you decided that stealing from vulnerable women was more important than honoring your marriage vows." The door closed behind them, and Rachel was alone in the house that had harbored so many secrets. But her work was far from finished. David's arrest was just the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign that would ensure his crimes became a public warning and his victims received the justice they deserved. Within hours of David's arrest, Rachel's media strategy began unfolding exactly as she had planned. The press release she had prepared in advance was distributed to local news outlets, social media platforms, and victim advocacy organizations across the country. The headline read, "Denver IT consultant arrested for multi-state catfishing scheme that defrauded dozens of women." The accompanying documentation included victim testimonials, financial records showing the scope of David's thefts, and expert commentary about the psychology of online predators. Rachel had spent weeks cultivating relationships with journalists who specialized in covering cybercrime and domestic violence. She provided them with exclusive access to evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of David's systematic predatory behavior. This isn't just a story about one man's infidelity. This is about a sophisticated criminal enterprise that targeted vulnerable women across multiple states and destroyed lives for profit. The interview aired during the evening news, featuring Rachel as the wronged wife who had uncovered her husband's crimes and helped law enforcement build their case. The story positioned her as a hero rather than a victim, a narrative she had carefully crafted to maintain control over her own reputation. But the media exposure was only one component of Rachel's comprehensive justice campaign. She had also been working with Kelly Morrison and the victim advocacy group to organize a class action lawsuit that would recover damages for all of David's victims. The lawsuit filed the day after David's arrest sought compensation for financial losses, emotional distress, and punitive damages that could potentially bankrupt him completely. More importantly, it established legal precedents that would make it easier for future catfishing victims to pursue restitution through civil courts. Mrs. Chen's cooperation has been instrumental in building this case, attorney Sarah Davidson explained during a press conference announcing the lawsuit. Her investigation and evidence gathering have allowed us to identify victims and document damages that might otherwise have gone unreported. Rachel stood beside the attorney, flanked by 3 of David's victims who had agreed to speak publicly about their experiences. The sight of these strong women united in their pursuit of justice was more satisfying than any personal revenge Rachel could have imagined. Maria Santos described how Dr. Christopher Valdez convinced her to relocate to San Antonio and invest her savings in his fabricated medical practice. Jennifer Walsh explained how James Park's sudden disappearance had triggered a mental health crisis that required months of therapy to overcome. Kelly Morrison detailed the financial devastation of moving to Miami to be with a man who didn't exist. Each woman's testimony revealed the human cost of David's crimes while demonstrating their resilience in working together to hold him accountable. The press conference generated national media attention and sparked conversations about online safety and victim advocacy that reached millions of people. But Rachel's most ambitious initiative was yet to be revealed. Working with cybersecurity experts and victim advocacy organizations, she had developed an educational program that would prevent other women from falling victim to similar schemes. The program, called Digital Red Flags, combined Rachel's investigative techniques with expert knowledge about online predatory behavior. It taught women how to recognize catfishing attempts, verify online identities, and protect themselves from emotional and financial exploitation. Every woman who learns to spot these warning signs is a potential victim who won't be deceived, Rachel explained during the program's launch event. David targeted women who were isolated and vulnerable. Our goal is to ensure that no woman has to face these predators alone. The program quickly gained traction with law enforcement agencies, social service organizations, and educational institutions across the country. Rachel found herself traveling to conferences and workshops, sharing her expertise with audiences who were amazed by her transformation from victim to advocate. Meanwhile, David's criminal case was proceeding exactly as Rachel had orchestrated. The evidence she had gathered was so comprehensive that his defense attorney advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than face trial. The charges included wire fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and criminal impersonation across multiple jurisdictions. The federal prosecutor was seeking a sentence of 8 to 12 years in prison, plus restitution that would strip David of every asset he had acquired through his criminal activities. Rachel attended every court hearing, sitting in the front row where David could see her while prosecutors presented evidence of his crimes.
She wanted him to understand that his arrest was not random bad luck or investigative coincidence. It was the result of her deliberate decision to hold him accountable for his actions. The plea hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December, 3 days before what would have been their 21st wedding anniversary. Rachel arrived early, wearing the same navy suit she had worn on the day of David's arrest. David entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, looking smaller and more defeated than she had ever seen him. When his eyes met hers across the courtroom, she saw recognition of her role in his downfall, along with something that might have been respect. Judge Patricia Hernandez reviewed the plea agreement with clinical precision, detailing each charge and the corresponding penalties David would face. The financial restitution alone exceeded $150,000, representing not just the money he had stolen, but also damages for emotional distress and punitive awards. "Mr. Chen," Judge Hernandez said, "do you understand that by accepting this plea agreement, you are admitting to conducting a systematic criminal enterprise that defrauded dozens of women across multiple states?" "Yes, Your Honor," David replied quietly. "Do you understand that your actions caused significant financial and emotional harm to vulnerable individuals who trusted you?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you accept responsibility for your crimes and acknowledge that your victims deserve compensation for the damages you inflicted?" David was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Yes, Your Honor, I accept responsibility, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused." Judge Hernandez sentenced David to 10 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, during which he would be prohibited from using dating websites, social media platforms, or any form of online communication that wasn't monitored by authorities. The asset forfeiture order stripped David of their house, his retirement accounts, his vehicles, and any other property that could be traced to his criminal activities. Rachel would receive half of the marital assets that weren't connected to his crimes, while the remainder would be liquidated to pay restitution to his victims. As David was led away to begin serving his sentence, he looked back at Rachel one final time.
She met his gaze without emotion, feeling neither satisfaction nor sadness, but rather a sense of completion. The man who had built elaborate fantasies online would spend the next decade in a concrete cell, confronting the reality of his actions without the ability to escape into digital deceptions. The punishment fit the crime perfectly. After the sentencing, Rachel met with the victim advocacy group at a downtown restaurant to celebrate their collective victory. Kelly Morrison raised a toast to Rachel's courage in exposing David's crimes and helping them organize their response. 6 months ago, we were all isolated victims who felt ashamed and powerless, Kelly said. Today, we're survivors who've helped send a predator to prison and created resources that will protect other women from similar harm. Maria Santos added, Rachel showed us that we didn't have to accept being victims. We could become advocates who turn our pain into power. Jennifer Walsh, who had recovered significantly from her mental health crisis, spoke about the healing power of collective action. David tried to make us feel worthless and disposable. Working together to hold him accountable proved that we're strong and valuable. The lawsuit settlement was finalized 2 months later, providing financial compensation that helped the victims rebuild their lives. Kelly was able to pay off the debts she had incurred moving to Miami and start her own consulting business. Maria returned to nursing school to complete her degree. Jennifer published a book about recovering from online predatory relationships. But the impact of Rachel's advocacy extended far beyond David's immediate victims. The Digital Red Flags program had reached over 50,000 women through workshops, online courses, and educational materials. Law enforcement agencies were reporting increased awareness of catfishing schemes and more sophisticated victim reporting. Dating websites had implemented stronger verification procedures and warning systems based on the patterns Rachel had identified in David's criminal methods. Social media platforms were using her research to develop algorithms that could detect suspicious account creation and messaging patterns. Rachel's transformation from betrayed wife to victim advocate had become a model for turning personal trauma into social change. She received speaking requests from organizations across the country, all wanting to learn how she had channeled her anger into effective action. The personal healing was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of her journey. Rachel had entered the investigation feeling violated and powerless, questioning her judgment and her ability to trust other people. She emerged feeling confident, capable, and purposeful. I spent 20 years defining myself through my marriage to a man who turned out to be a stranger, she told an audience at a victim advocacy conference. Now, I define myself through my ability to help other women recognize their own strength and demand the respect they deserve. Rachel's real estate career had also flourished as a result of the publicity surrounding her advocacy work. Clients appreciated her investigative skills and her reputation for uncovering hidden problems. She specialized in helping divorced women navigate property transactions and financial planning, using her experience to guide others through difficult transitions. The house that she had shared with David was sold as part of the asset forfeiture proceedings, but Rachel used her portion of the settlement to purchase a smaller home in a different neighborhood. She wanted a fresh start in a space that wasn't contaminated by memories of David's deceptions. The new house became headquarters for her advocacy work, with a home office dedicated to victim services and educational outreach. Rachel found deep satisfaction in transforming the space where she had once been deceived into a center for empowering other women. 1 year after David's arrest, Rachel received a letter from him in federal prison. She almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of her. The letter was 4 pages of handwritten apologies and explanations, with David claiming that prison had given him perspective on the harm he had caused. He wrote about therapy sessions with prison counselors and his newfound understanding of the psychological damage inflicted by his crimes. "I know I can never undo the pain I caused you and all those other women," he wrote, but I want you to know that I finally understand why you had to stop me. I was sick, and I couldn't see it until you forced me to face the truth." Rachel read the letter twice, searching for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but the tone seemed genuine, lacking the calculated charm that had characterized David's previous communications. The letter concluded with a request that surprised her. "I know you've become an advocate for catfishing victims, and I think that's incredible. If you ever think it would be helpful, I'd be willing to participate in your educational programs. Maybe hearing from someone who actually committed these crimes could help other people understand the warning signs." Rachel set the letter aside and considered David's offer for several days. There was something appealing about the idea of using her former husband's crimes as a teaching tool, forcing him to confront his victims and explain his methods to audiences who would judge him harshly. But ultimately, Rachel decided that David had already played his role in her story. Her advocacy work was about empowering victims and preventing future harm, not providing rehabilitation opportunities for convicted predators. She wrote back with a brief response. "I appreciate your apology, but my work is focused on helping survivors, not reforming offenders. I hope you use your remaining prison time to develop genuine empathy for the people you hurt." That was the last communication between them. Rachel had spent enough of her life dealing with David's lies and manipulations.
Her energy was better invested in helping other women avoid similar devastation. The second anniversary of David's arrest found Rachel speaking at a national conference on cybercrime prevention. The audience included law enforcement officers, victim advocates, mental health professionals, and survivors of online predatory schemes. 2 years ago, I thought I was married to a quiet, reliable man who preferred books to parties, Rachel told the audience. I discovered that I was actually married to a sophisticated predator who had been systematically destroying women's lives for his own gratification. She paused to let the weight of that statement settle before continuing. But I also discovered that I was stronger, smarter, and more resourceful than I had ever imagined. The investigation that sent my husband to prison taught me that victims don't have to remain powerless. We can become advocates who protect others from similar harm. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but what meant more to Rachel were the individual conversations afterward. Women approached her to share their own experiences with online deception, their struggles with rebuilding trust, and their gratitude for her advocacy work. One young woman named Ashley described how the Digital Red Flags program had helped her recognize manipulation tactics in an online relationship before she became emotionally or financially invested. "Your work literally saved me from becoming another victim," she said with tears in her eyes. An older woman named Margaret explained how Rachel's story had given her the courage to report her own experience with a catfishing scheme. "I felt so stupid for being deceived, but you showed me that smart, successful women can be targeted by these predators. It wasn't my fault." These conversations reminded Rachel why her advocacy work was so important. Every woman who learned to recognize manipulation tactics was a potential victim who wouldn't be deceived. Every survivor who found the courage to report their experience was helping build cases against other predators. The ripple effects of Rachel's investigation continued to expand in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her documentation techniques had been adopted by law enforcement agencies investigating similar crimes. Her victim advocacy model had been replicated by organizations across the country. Her educational materials had been translated into multiple languages and distributed internationally. David's crimes had been horrible, but Rachel had transformed that horror into a force for positive change that would protect countless other women from similar devastation. The victim had become the victor, not through revenge, but through service to others who faced similar challenges. As Rachel drove home from the conference, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from devastating betrayal to purposeful advocacy. The woman who had discovered her husband's laptop open to a fake Facebook profile had become a nationally recognized expert on cybercrime prevention and victim empowerment. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick,
There had been sleepless nights filled with rage and grief, moments of doubt about her ability to rebuild her life, and setbacks that made her question whether justice was possible. But Rachel had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or forgiving the unforgivable. It was about taking control of her narrative and using her experience to create positive change in the world. David would spend the next 8 years in federal prison, his crimes serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of online predatory behavior. Rachel would spend those same years helping other women recognize their own strength and demand the respect they deserved. The catfisher had been caught and contained, but more importantly, his victims had been transformed from powerless targets into powerful advocates. That transformation was Rachel's greatest victory and David's most fitting punishment. Justice had been served, not through revenge or retribution, but through the creation of resources and support systems that would prevent other women from experiencing similar devastation. The digital predator's crimes had ultimately made the online world safer for everyone. Epilogue: The Ripple Effect. 5 years after David Chen was sentenced to federal prison for his elaborate catfishing scheme, Rachel Martinez had become one of the most recognized voices in cybercrime prevention and victim advocacy. Her transformation from betrayed wife to national expert had created ripple effects that extended far beyond her personal quest for justice, touching thousands of lives and fundamentally changing how society understood and responded to online predatory behavior. The Digital Red Flags program had evolved into a comprehensive educational initiative that reached over 2 million people annually through workshops, online courses, corporate training programs, and university curricula. What had started as Rachel's personal mission to prevent other women from experiencing her devastation had become a movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about online safety and victim responsibility. Standing in the auditorium at Georgetown University's Cybersecurity Institute, Rachel addressed an audience of federal law enforcement officials, technology industry leaders, and international cybercrime experts. The symposium on combating digital deception had drawn participants from 37 countries, all seeking to understand and replicate the success of her victim-centered approach to online predator prevention. 5 years ago, I thought cybercrime was something that happened to other people, Rachel began, her voice carrying the authority that came from lived experience and proven expertise. Naive people who should have known better, careless people who ignored obvious warning signs. I discovered that predators don't target stupidity or carelessness. They target human needs for connection, validation, and love. The audience listened with rapt attention as Rachel described the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that her former husband had employed. But rather than focusing on David's crimes, she emphasized the strength and resilience of his victims, reframing the narrative from one of victimization to one of survival and empowerment. "My husband didn't succeed because his victims were weak," she explained. "He succeeded because he was skilled at identifying and exploiting normal human vulnerabilities. The solution isn't teaching people to be less human, it's teaching them to recognize manipulation and respond effectively when they encounter it." This philosophical shift had become the cornerstone of Rachel's advocacy work and had influenced policy changes at the highest levels of government and industry. Traditional cybersecurity education had focused on technical solutions and victim-blaming warnings about online behavior. Rachel's approach emphasized empowerment, community support, and systemic changes that made predatory behavior more difficult and less profitable. The results spoke for themselves. In the 5 years since Rachel began her advocacy work, reports of catfishing schemes had increased dramatically, not because the crimes were becoming more common, but because victims were more likely to recognize the manipulation and seek help. Law enforcement agencies reported that victims were providing higher quality evidence and pursuing prosecution more aggressively, leading to longer sentences and more comprehensive restitution orders. Major technology companies had implemented dozens of safety features based on Rachel's research and recommendations. Dating platforms now require identity verification, employ artificial intelligence to detect suspicious messaging patterns, and provide immediate access to victim support resources. Social media companies had developed algorithms that can identify fake profiles using stolen photos and flag accounts that exhibit predatory behavior patterns. But perhaps most importantly, Rachel's work had changed how society understood and responded to victims of online crimes. The shame and victim blaming that had traditionally surrounded catfishing cases had been replaced by recognition that these crimes required sophisticated manipulation techniques and deliberately targeted vulnerable populations. Dr. Amanda Torres, a forensic psychologist who had collaborated with Rachel on multiple research projects, introduced her at the Georgetown Symposium with words that captured the scope of her impact. Rachel Martinez didn't just solve her own case, Dr. Torres said. She revolutionized how we understand, investigate, and prevent online predatory behavior. Her victim-centered approach has become the gold standard for cybercrime response, and her advocacy has prevented countless other families from experiencing similar devastation. The research component of Rachel's work had produced academic papers that were cited in courtrooms, legislative hearings, and university courses around the world. Her documentation of David's methods had revealed patterns and techniques that were being used by online predators globally, providing law enforcement with tools to identify and prosecute similar crimes more effectively. One of her most significant contributions was the development of the Predatory Pattern Assessment, a standardized tool that helped investigators recognize the difference between isolated online deception and systematic predatory behavior. The assessment had been adopted by law enforcement agencies in 43 states and was being translated for use by international cybercrime units. The tool analyzed communication patterns, photo sources, identity construction techniques, and victim targeting methods to determine whether an online relationship involved random dishonesty or calculated psychological manipulation. Cases that met the criteria for predatory behavior were fast-tracked for investigation and prosecution, while isolated incidents of online deception were handled through victim services and restorative justice programs. Major technology companies had implemented dozens of safety features based on Rachel's research and recommendations. Dating platforms now require identity verification, employ artificial intelligence to detect suspicious messaging patterns, and provide immediate access to victim support resources. Social media companies had developed algorithms that can identify fake profiles using stolen photos and flag accounts that exhibit predatory behavior patterns. But perhaps most importantly, Rachel's work had changed how society understood and responded to victims of online crimes. The shame and victim blaming that had traditionally surrounded catfishing cases had been recognized.
This systematic approach had led to the identification and prosecution of dozens of large-scale catfishing operations that might otherwise have remained undetected. Law enforcement agencies reported that Rachel's methods had helped them recognize connected cases across multiple jurisdictions, leading to more comprehensive investigations and longer sentences for repeat offenders. The international component of Rachel's work had emerged organically as her methods gained recognition beyond the United States. She had consulted with law enforcement agencies in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the European Union, helping them develop culturally appropriate versions of her educational and investigative tools. In the Philippines, where romance scams had become a significant economic sector, Rachel's victim empowerment approach had been adapted for use in rural communities where traditional cybersecurity education was ineffective. Local advocates used her techniques to help residents recognize and report predatory behavior while building support networks for victims who had been financially exploited. Similar adaptations had been implemented in Nigeria, where her research on victim targeting had helped law enforcement understand how international romance scammers selected and groomed their targets. The insights had led to more effective prevention campaigns and higher prosecution rates for cross-border cybercrime. But the impact that meant the most to Rachel was the transformation of individual victims into advocates and leaders. The women who had been deceived by her former husband had become powerful voices for change, using their experiences to educate others and advocate for stronger legal protections. Kelly Morrison had leveraged her business experience to establish the National Catfishing Victim Support Network, which provided legal advocacy, emotional support, and financial assistance to victims of online romance fraud. The organization had helped over 3,000 victims pursue restitution and had lobbied successfully for stronger federal penalties for romance scam crimes.
Maria Santos had returned to nursing and specialized in treating victims of psychological abuse and manipulation. She had developed trauma-informed care protocols specifically for cybercrime victims and trained medical professionals to recognize the signs of online exploitation. Her work had improved healthcare responses to victims who might otherwise have been dismissed or misunderstood. Jennifer Walsh had written 3 books about recovering from online predatory relationships and had become a sought-after speaker at victim advocacy conferences. Her memoir, Loving a Ghost, had reached the New York Times bestseller list and had been credited with helping thousands of victims understand that their experiences were not unique or shameful. Each of these women had transformed their victimization into a force for positive change, creating a multiplier effect that extended Rachel's impact far beyond what she could have achieved alone. They had proven that recovery from online predatory abuse was not just possible, but could become a source of strength and purpose that benefited entire communities. The corporate training component of Rachel's work had addressed workplace cybersecurity from an entirely new perspective. Rather than focusing solely on technical threats, her programs helped employees recognize how personal vulnerabilities could be exploited by criminals seeking access to corporate systems and information. Companies reported significant reductions in successful phishing attacks, social engineering attacks, and insider threat incidents after implementing Rachel's human-centered cybersecurity training. Employees who understood how emotional manipulation worked were better equipped to recognize and resist sophisticated psychological attacks that bypassed traditional technical security measures. The educational impact extended into academic institutions as well. Rachel had developed curricula for high schools and universities that taught digital literacy through the lens of psychological manipulation and emotional intelligence. Students learned to recognize predatory behavior patterns not just in romantic contexts, but in friendship, professional, and financial relationships as well. These programs had shown remarkable success in reducing victimization rates among young adults, who were traditionally considered high-risk targets for online predators. Students who completed Rachel's educational modules were significantly more likely to report suspicious online behavior and seek help when they encountered manipulation attempts. The policy implications of Rachel's work had reached the highest levels of government. She had testified before congressional committees investigating online safety, consulted with federal agencies developing cybercrime prosecution guidelines, and advised international organizations working to combat cross-border digital crime. Her recommendations had influenced the development of stronger federal penalties for romance fraud, expanded victim compensation programs, and improved law enforcement training standards for cybercrime investigation. The legislation she had helped draft was being considered as a model for international cooperation agreements on cybercrime prosecution. But perhaps the most profound impact of Rachel's advocacy was the cultural shift it had catalyzed around victim responsibility and blame. The traditional narrative that portrayed cybercrime victims as foolish or careless had been replaced by recognition that these crimes required sophisticated manipulation techniques and deliberately exploited normal human psychology. Media coverage of cybercrime cases now routinely included expert commentary about manipulation techniques rather than focusing on victim mistakes. News stories emphasized the predatory behavior of criminals rather than the perceived gullibility of their targets. This shift had encouraged more victims to report crimes and seek help, leading to higher prosecution rates and better outcomes for survivors. The therapeutic community had also embraced Rachel's insights about the psychological impact of online predatory behavior. Mental health professionals now received training about the specific trauma patterns associated with digital manipulation, and specialized treatment protocols had been developed for victims of romance fraud and catfishing schemes. Research conducted in collaboration with Rachel's advocacy organization demonstrated that victims of online romance fraud experience trauma symptoms similar to those seen in domestic violence survivors. This recognition had led to expanded mental health services and trauma-informed legal advocacy that addressed the full scope of harm caused by these crimes. The technology industry's response to Rachel's work had been comprehensive and ongoing. Major platforms had implemented user safety features based on her research, including enhanced profile verification, suspicious activity alerts, and immediate access to victim support resources. Artificial intelligence systems had been developed to detect predatory communication patterns and intervene before financial or emotional harm occurred. But the industry had also embraced Rachel's emphasis on user empowerment rather than paternalistic protection. Educational resources and safety tools were designed to help users make informed decisions rather than restricting their ability to form online connections. This approach had proven more effective than heavy-handed content moderation and had been praised by privacy advocates and user rights organizations. The international law enforcement community had adopted Rachel's investigative techniques as standard practice for romance fraud cases. Training programs based on her methods were being conducted in countries around the world, and international cooperation on cybercrime cases had improved dramatically as investigators learned to recognize and share information about predatory behavior patterns. Europol, Interpol, and other international law enforcement organizations have incorporated Rachel's research into their cybercrime prevention and investigation protocols. The standardized approach had made it easier to track criminals who operate across multiple countries, leading to more successful prosecutions and longer sentences for international romance scammers. The victim advocacy movement that had grown out of Rachel's work had become a powerful force for legislative and social change. Organizations founded by cybercrime survivors were successfully lobbying for stronger victim protections, expanded compensation programs, and improved law enforcement training standards for cybercrime investigation. The legislation she had helped draft was being considered as a model for international cooperation agreements on cybercrime prosecution. But perhaps the most profound impact of Rachel's advocacy was a cultural shift it had catalyzed around victim responsibility and blame. The traditional narrative that portrayed cybercrime victims as foolish or careless had been recognized that these crimes required sophisticated manipulation techniques and deliberately exploited normal human psychology. Media coverage of cybercrime cases now routinely included expert commentary about manipulation techniques rather than focusing on victim mistakes. News stories emphasized the predatory behavior of criminals rather than the perceived gullibility of their targets. This shift had encouraged more victims to report crimes and seek help, leading to higher prosecution rates and better outcomes for survivors. The therapeutic community had also embraced Rachel's insights about the psychological impact of online predatory behavior. Mental health professionals now received training about the specific trauma patterns associated with digital manipulation, and specialized treatment protocols had been developed for victims of romance fraud and catfishing schemes. Research conducted in collaboration with Rachel's advocacy organization demonstrated that victims of online romance fraud experience trauma symptoms similar to those seen in domestic violence survivors. This recognition had led to expanded mental health services and trauma-informed legal advocacy that addressed the full scope of harm caused by these crimes. The technology industry's response to Rachel's work had been comprehensive and ongoing. Major platforms had implemented user safety features based on her research, including enhanced profile verification, suspicious activity alerts, and immediate access to victim support resources. Artificial intelligence systems had been developed to detect predatory communication patterns and intervene before financial or emotional harm occurred. But the industry had also embraced Rachel's emphasis on user empowerment rather than paternalistic protection. Educational resources and safety tools were designed to help users make informed decisions rather than restricting their ability to form online connections. This approach had proven more effective